Good morning, dear friends, colleagues, distinguished guests, and viewers. My name is Mikael Ley, and I'm the Secretary General of Solidar. I'm happy to welcome you to this second day of the fourth edition of the Africa Week of the SND, which focuses on a strengthened partnership between the EU and Africa. We are sending live from socialist and democrats.eu and through social media. And please use the hashtag with Africa during these days. The first day of this week proved to be a success, with more than 400 participants in the course of the day, and represents another step towards shaping a more progressive EU-Africa partnership. Today we are pleased to gather for a discussion on how to best promote decent work and social protection for all. In this webinar that we, as Solidar, co-organizes with FES. The global pandemic is devastating to lives, societies, and economies. And if the experience of this ongoing health crisis tells us anything, it is that a strong society, with robust and universal social security systems that fosters trust and solidarity, is required to face the challenges it comes with. There's good reason to see all this as a pre-trial to the coming dramatic consequences of the climate and environmental emergency, as well as the periodic financial crisis we are seeing. And what we're living through right now clearly shows how interdependent and extremely unequal this world is, how unsustainable and dangerous the neoliberal model is, and that the time is now for a new political and economic agenda through a new social contract. With ILO putting more than half of the world's population without any kind of social security coverage, we have a huge task ahead of us, but one that will be defined by political will and persistence rather than lack of options. We know what is needed: progressive tax systems, robust international regulatory framework to limit illicit capital flows and financial flight, public investments, and equality in terms of access and availability, as well as a well-functioning labor markets defined by proper wage levels, health and security regulations, etc., etc. We know what needs to be done. And today I'm looking forward to looking at both the circumstances we are living under, as well as how we shall make it happen in Europe and on the African continent. An enhanced cooperation and partnership between the European Union and Africa could help promote and strengthen social protection systems for all, as a vital component for a just transition. As progressives, we should face these challenges with confidence, offering a different path to a new normal, one that builds resilience and one that offers hope. But before getting started with the discussion, let us now listen to Mr. Nicholas Smith, European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, opening speech on EU-Africa cooperation and the importance of decent work and social protection in and beyond Europe. Mr. Schmidt, the floor is yours.
Closest neighbor. It is home to more than 1 billion people, and it has the youngest, fastest growing middle class in the world. But Africa is also home to 6 million victims of forced labor. Half of the victims of child labor across the world live in Africa. With the COVID-19 crisis, these figures will increase and poverty will gain ground, despite the financing. Dear friends, Africa is our closest neighbor. It is home to more than 1 billion people, and it has the youngest, fastest growing middle class in the world.
Dear all, it seems that we have an issue with the video screening. So maybe we will have the opportunity to come back to the screening of the video in the course of the day when the technological aspects are working again. I think so. All right. Then thank you, Mr. Schmidt. We'll come back to you later on, hopefully. Then without further ado, let's continue with today's discussions. While we see tendencies in both Europe and Africa of countries and governments that are stepping up their efforts to ensure access to the right to social protection and decent work, several real challenges remain. Throughout today's discussion, we will go deeper into how to bridge the social protection funding gap to establish and maintain national social protection floors, which initiatives at European and international level that could help closing this gap, what good practices exist at national level that could serve as a model, and how the EU will work through its domestic and external policies to ensure that everyone has ensured its right to a decent income and quality essential services. Please note that as a participant and viewer, you're most welcome to ask your questions through the Solidar and the S&D group Facebook chat. We will collect them in a Q&A session a bit later on. But let's now leave the floor to our distinguished panel of experts. You all have 8 to 10 minutes each, and we will start with a good friend and colleague from the ILO, Ms. Christina Berendt, head of the Social Policy Unit at the International Labour Organization, based in Geneva, widely published on social protection in both developed and developing countries, including the extension of social protection to those in the informal economy in relation to income distribution and poverty alleviation, to only quote a few of her work. Christina will do an overview of how COVID-19 has dramatically highlighted the urgent need for social protection for all and the financial possibility to reach this target. Christina, the floor is yours. Christina, you have to unmute.
Sorry, I thought I. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, and hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you in this panel discussion. And indeed, as you said, the topic of decent work and social protection for all could not be more timely and more relevant today. I mean, we have all seen how much the COVID-19 pandemic has a devastating consequences on people's health and on countries' economic and social fabric. And we're still in the middle of it. And it's not only that the crisis has affected those extremely strongly who were already vulnerable before the crisis, but it has also scattered the lives of many of those who were relatively well off before the crisis hit. And I think this already brings me to my first point. It's really the need for universal social protection systems for all that can protect everyone. So it's not just for the poor, but social protection is really something that everyone needs. And in Europe, we have seen that countries with relatively solid social protection systems could react immediately and very forcefully to the crisis. They have ensured the effective access to healthcare, including the testing and treatment, They have ensured that people have sickness benefits and paid sickness paid sick leave that have allowed them to stay at home when sick or potentially infected, thereby also preventing the virus from spreading to others. They have mobilized their unemployment protection schemes, which have played an enormously important role in preventing unemployment, protecting jobs, and also supporting those who have lost their jobs. And of course, also social assistance benefits, which have provided at least a basic level of income security to those in need. And yet, with all this quite powerful response, the COVID-19 crisis has also tested the limits of European social protection systems and has exposed very important coverage and adequacy gaps, particularly for those who were struggling already before the crisis, such as workers on digital platforms, solo entrepreneurs, workers on temporary contracts, those in the informal economy, just to list a few. So in reaction to this, many European countries have put in place quite unprecedented measures to close those coverage and adequacy gaps, at least on a temporary basis, and to protect people's health, jobs, and incomes. And this has been quite an impressive policy response, even if there's much more to be wished for. However, in many parts of Africa, the existing social protection systems were not sufficiently developed for such a strong and automatic response. Before the crisis, only 18% of the population in Africa, compared to more than 80% in Europe and Central Asia, were protected by the existing social protection systems. And many of those without social protection are working in the informal economy and are extremely vulnerable. So also African countries have introduced temporary crisis response measures, but given their more limited fiscal and institutional capacities, this could not allow for an as comprehensive response as in Europe. And this brings me to my second point, the need to invest more in social protection to close those large social protection gaps. And in fact, recent ILO estimates have shown that the financing gap for social protection in developing countries has further increased by about 1/3 compared to what was there before the crisis. So developing countries would require an additional kind of 1.2 trillion in social protection expenditure per year, which corresponds to about 3.8% of their GDP. In sub-Saharan Africa, $136.9 billion would be required, corresponding to about 8.2% of their GDP. And while in principle, to be sustainable, really those social protection systems should really be financed predominantly from national sources. But it's very clear that this is not possible for many low-income countries in the short term. So, I mean, although countries can do a lot to increase domestic resource mobilization through reallocating public spending, broadening the tax base, fighting tax evasion, fighting illicit financial flows, this is not sufficient. So, for countries really to be able to kickstart the development of their social protection systems and improve what's already there, and in particular to build a solid social protection floor, it is necessary really to provide them with more support and also an international response that goes beyond what is currently provided. And of course, investing more in social protection is absolutely essential, but we also think about investing better and making sure that social protection systems really follow a rights-based approach, also that's in line with human rights instruments, international social security standards, and international good practice. So just to highlight 3 points very, very quickly. The first one is really respecting the principle of solidarity in financing. Really making sure that everyone has the protection needed, but also that those who have the capacity to contribute actually do so. Forging a broad national dialogue on social protection is important, involving social partners and other stakeholders, and also involving all relevant ministries, including ministries of finance and planning. It's important to really build sustainable and effective social protection policies and strategies. And closely related to that, also anchoring social protection systems in national law is important to really make them more stable, to make them more predictable, and ensure transparency and accountability. That provides also a more solid basis for public finance management. And in fact, the ILO works already very closely with the European Union in supporting countries to increase their fiscal space on social protection. So there is an existing program where the ILO collaborates with UNICEF and also the Global Coalition for Social Protection Force on improving synergies between public finance management and social protection, which provides technical support to several African countries and complementing the EU's budget support for social protection. And in addition, the ILO supports also a large number of other countries through other mechanisms. So these joint efforts have never been more important. So, and that brings me to my third and final point. So it's really, we're currently really at a crossroads when it comes to social protection system, given that many countries are already facing fiscal difficulties, facing high levels of debt, especially that could actually drive them into premature fiscal consolidation. But nothing could be more wrong than that. I think if the COVID-19 pandemic has sent the world one message, is that we are only as safe as the most vulnerable among us. It has really served as a wake-up call, alerting the global community also to the crucial importance of social protection. So countries should really use the current political momentum and recognition also of the importance of social protection to build on these temporary relief measures that they have enacted, but really transform them into sustainable social protection systems that can provide adequate and comprehensive coverage for all throughout people's lives course and are adapted to the changing world of work. And this is actually the call that has been adopted by all the ILO's kind of 187 member states, the governments, workers and employers in June 2019 in the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work. So moving forward with that and really especially building nationally defined social protection laws that can guarantee at least a basic level of social security to everyone is really essential. And at this important crossroads, the European Union can play a key role in supporting African countries in the context of the partnership in reinforcing their social protection systems. And this is absolutely essential for countries to move to a better normal and to be better prepared for the future challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this very elaborated but yet summarized overview of where we are and what's at play as we stand at this crossroads in relation to social protection schemes and decent work, but also in a way in terms of political morality and whether we will be able to comply with the promises of the SDGs of leaving no one behind. So thank you, Christina, very much for this first remark. I'm told that now we are able to listen to our friend Nicola Smith, Commissioner for Social Rights and Jobs. So let's turn back to Nicola for a brief period, and then we'll come back with an intervention of Ms. Evelyn Astor from the ITUC. So without further ado, Mr. Schmidt, you're on.
Dear friends, Africa is our closest neighbor. It is home to more than 1 billion people, and it has the youngest, fastest growing middle class in the world. But Africa is also home to 6 million victims of forced labor. Half of the victims of child labor across the world live in Africa. With the COVID-19 crisis, these figures will increase, and poverty will gain ground, despite the financing mobilized by the EU and its members to help African countries face the social consequences of the crisis. I believe everyone today understands that this is an issue for Europe, because our continent stands for human rights and dignity. Because Africa is our neighbor and partner, and we care about its people. It's also fair to say that we bear some responsibility for what happens in Africa's labor market, as in Europe, we buy the goods they produce. Just like Europeans, Africans need and deserve decent jobs. They also need adequate social protection systems to help them cope with the hazards of life. Let me briefly review how we can contribute to these objectives. One area of action is trade. In our trade policy with Africa, we will ensure that development aid and trade privileges comply with the commitments taken with regard to decent work and labor standards. A second area is corporate governance. This Commission will design a framework so companies manage their supply chains abroad responsibly, which is currently not the case for 2/3 of them. I therefore welcome the initiative of the German presidency to respect human and social rights in global supply chains. A third area is youth. 1 in 5 young people in Africa has no work, training, or education prospect. The EU shares its experience on youth policies and it funds African national programs. In South Africa, for example, the EU has helped develop a support package for young people disconnected from the labor market, based on our youth guarantee. Gender equality is also key. We have to support actively the education of girls. And the fourth area is social protection. With its development aid, the EU supports the establishment of social protection floors in its partner countries in Africa. The COVID-19 crisis has underlined the essential nature of this work. I could mention many more areas of cooperation. We are helping to develop the social economy that can offer a solid alternative to the informal economy that has no rights. We also have to contribute to building social partners' capacities. We recently unveiled new rules to improve migration and asylum procedures. It is about protecting those in need and offering legal migration possibilities. And we are also committed to international standards from the International Labour Organization on social dialogue and decent work. I am sure these will be some of the topics you will address today. Dear friends, we all want to offer Europeans decent working conditions and adequate social protection. Living on one continent rather than another should not offer more or fewer rights. Your panel discussion will, I hope, be the occasion to discuss new avenues for our policies in Africa and reaffirm our commitment to promote decent work and social protection everywhere, in and beyond Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Nicolas Schmidt, for that then second remark during this day. We hope to continue our conversation in the way that Mr. Schmidt ended his intervention, with the intervention by Ms. Evelyn Astor, an economic and social policy advisor at the International Trade Union Confederation, based in Brussels. Much of her work focused on improving the adequacy and coverage of minimum wages and supporting unions in their minimum wage negotiations. She also worked with unions on improving access to social protection and identifying financing possibilities for social protection reforms. Evelyn will focus on the possibilities and opportunities to finance social protection in the EU, but also on the African continent. Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. And first of all, thank you to Solidar and the FES and the S&D Group for jointly organizing this discussion. I will start by remarking that this COVID crisis has brutally revealed the case for developing strong social protection systems. Suddenly, governments are acknowledging the urgency of unemployment protection for people who have lost their livelihoods from this crisis, the need for paid sickness benefits, access to health care. But I think it's important to take a step back and remember that even before this crisis, only half of the world's population had access to any form of social protection. And only 1/3 of the world's population had access to comprehensive social protection schemes in line with ILO standards. And if we speak about Africa, the situation is even more acute, where you have 82% of the population not covered by any social protection benefit. We need to acknowledge that these coverage gaps are especially acute in the case of precarious work, informal work, and also for women because of their unpaid care work. And this, of course, highlights the need of supporting decent work and formalization of the informal economy, as well as measures to support gender equality within the labor market. Now, while it's important to mention that there have been many positive measures that governments are taking to address the challenges of this crisis, we need to avoid patchwork solutions. We want statutory rights-based social protection systems that are grounded in law. And this will help to support a recovery and build resilience for the next crisis, whether it be a health crisis or another sort of economic crisis. Now, we can't discuss extending social protection without addressing how to pay for these extensions, and so I'm happy to speak about financing today. We can't afford it is a pretty regular response from many governments when unions demand better social protection, but the truth is often a bit more nuanced than that. Financing social protection is not always, but very often, a question of political will. And Christina, in her previous presentation, she mentioned the figure of 1.2 trillion US dollars. So that's the estimate of the ILO to provide a universal social protection floor for this year for low and middle income countries. Now, this might appear to be a lot of money. Of course, you should put aside the fact that the COVID stimulus package of the US was double that amount, just for the US. But let's acknowledge also two things. First of all, poverty and inequality have recognized widespread economic and social costs, and also that social protection has been shown to have a number of important economic benefits, especially when it comes to stabilizing the economy and stimulating aggregate demand. It can prevent crisis from actually getting worse and supporting a swifter recovery. And we saw that in the previous financial crisis of 2008 to 2012. Now, when creating fiscal space at the national level, mobilizing domestic resources, this is not necessarily easy. But as Christina mentioned, there are a number of options at government's disposal. And these include reprioritizing and reallocating public spending, looking also at social security contributions in a fair way between employers and workers. And we've seen in some countries, including in the EU as well as outside, that employer social security contributions have actually been reduced in recent years, which is actually undermining the financing base for social. I give the example of Romania, for example. Progressively raising tax revenue is also important, and I was very happy to see that Mikhail mentioned this in the introduction to this session, because we need to look at fair tax measures like corporate taxes, wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, and financial transaction taxes. Oxfam did a report last year that showed that only 4 cents in every dollar of tax revenue collected globally comes from taxes on wealth, such as inheritance or property taxes. And in fact, these types of taxes have been reduced or eliminated in many countries over recent years. Financial transparency, tackling tax evasion, addressing illicit financial flows can also bring significant revenues to states. I'll give you another figure. UNCTAD estimated that 88.6 billion, that's equivalent to 3.7% of Africa's GDP, leaves the continent annually in illicit capital flight. And that's actually more than double the amount of development assistance that's injected into the continent each year. I should say on this particular issue, ITUC Africa and its affiliates, including the Nigeria Labour Congress, and the Ghana Trades Union Congress and unions from Chad. They've been very active on this topic, and they've actually joined up with other civil society organizations for a Stop the Bleeding campaign, which is to push policymakers to curb illicit financial flows in Africa. Finally, I think strengthened development assistance does have an important role to play here because, as previously mentioned, even with all the possible measures at domestic level to expand fiscal space, there are going to be some countries, especially those least developed countries, that may find it challenging to raise enough revenue. And this is where the support of the international community comes in. I'll go back to the ILO costing estimates on fiscal space. They estimate that around 78 billion is needed to address the financing gaps for the world's poorest countries. That might not seem like a lot compared to the 1.2 trillion, but this represents around 15% of these countries' GDP. So, what should the EU and the international community do to provide support? That is a topic of this discussion today. I think we need to acknowledge, first of all, that Europe is by far the biggest donor when it comes to development assistance. The collective ODA from the EU and its member states amounts to around 75 billion, according to the OECD, and that's more than half. It's about 55% of global assistance. And in terms of EU programming, I think we can acknowledge that there's a very positive trend in the greater use of development assistance towards social protection and a shift away from supporting small-scale, heavily targeted schemes that are fragmented, this cash transfer program here, this health program in this region of Kenya here, to more comprehensive schemes with broad coverage that are actually grounded in law. And that's thanks in part to the fact that the EU has been providing a larger share of its bilateral ODA towards budget support. Around 35 to 40% of its bilateral ODA goes to budget support, and it increasingly is being used for social protection programs. Not only social protection, but it's a large share. We've also seen increasing cooperation between DG DevCo and the ILO when it comes to providing technical advice to developing countries on social protection, and we find this to be very positive in ensuring that development programs are in line with international labor standards, including ILO Convention 102 on social security and Recommendation 202 on social protection laws. And we find it also positive because it allows for a greater involvement in social partners in the planning and monitoring phases. But we should also be aware that overall development spending by EU member states are lower than their commitments. Within the EU, on average, around 0.46% of gross national income is spent on development assistance. And that's despite the fact that the EU countries, through the OECD DAC, have made commitments to achieve at least 0.7% of gross national income on numerous occasions. This commitment has been made for decades, and it's still not realized. Finally, I'd like to say a word around a proposal that seems to be floating around for the moment for an international solidarity instrument to support the extension specifically for social protection programs. This is the idea of a global fund put forward by Olivier de Schutter and Magdalena Sepulveda, and it's an idea that the ITUC is supportive of. And the idea of this fund would be to help catalyze social protection funding for those countries who have funding gaps that are too acute for them to be able to cover them on their own, at least in the short term. In other words, low-income countries, those experiencing the greatest financial shocks. And so the aim would be to help them build up adequate and sustainable systems over the long run. And there are precedents for other types of other international funds that might serve as inspiration. There is the Joint SDG Fund. There's also the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis. These might serve as inspiration. But I would conclude by saying that we think such an act of international solidarity is needed now more than ever. It would help to bridge the gap between those countries with strong social protection systems, including many of those in Europe, and those who do not have the capacity to build them up on their own, and could actually unite this world on a path towards an equitable recovery from this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Thank you for this very thorough walkthrough of the needs for financing and what actually can be done just by putting progressive policies in place on all spheres of the economy when it comes to trade, when it comes to financial flows, comes to taxation, as well as to our international solidarity obligations under, as you said, numerous occasions of pledges towards a zero point 0.7 GDP share to this effect. So thank you very much. We'll come back to, I think, the Global Fund, which is also an initiative that Solidar is supporting and been part of drafting. I now turn to Helen Modura, a program manager at the Africa Platform for Social Protection based in Kenya. Helen is a social protection policy specialist with a background in promoting economic and social rights. Her experience in human rights work include working with the most vulnerable groups, including women, children, elderly, and persons with disability. Helen will give us a clear and more concrete picture on how social protection systems are in place in Africa, with examples of good practices. So, Helen, we are eager to hear you and your intervention. Please, the floor is yours. You have 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mikhail, for the opportunity, and the organizers for the opportunity to be part of this Africa Week. I am indeed elated on behalf of my fellow Africans and also the platforms that we represent in the Africa Platform for Social Protection, being civil society organizations. The COVID-19 pandemic, if you look at it in comparison to Africa and Europe and the rest of the world, Africa has not been highly affected in terms of the numbers, but then the containment measures that happened at the onset of COVID-19 meant that a lot of people lost their jobs. And so we have a lot of people who are no longer in employment, or they have lost their source of income, and therefore it emerges that the need for social protection in Africa is going to be on the rise, or is on the rise already. We know that social protection in Africa has risen in the development agenda because of poverty, increased vulnerability, marginalization, HIV and AIDS, especially in the 1980s. We saw programs that emerged to support families that had been affected by this. And although different countries in Africa define social protection differently, we know that in Africa, many countries approach it from the 3 pillars. One being social assistance, secondly, social security, and thirdly, the health insurance aspect of social protection. In terms of social assistance programs, we have seen that they have gained popularity in fighting poverty. In fact, it has been used more like a magic bullet to address hunger and poverty. So we see a lot of cash grants, food for work programs, public work programs, among a range of other interventions. And we see countries having started these programs as small pilots, but eventually they grow into bigger programs. I'll give example. For example, in Kenya, because of the HIV pandemic a few years, many decades ago, we had a lot of orphans, and therefore UNICEF started pilots to show how the government can support orphans to continue being in school and also to meet their basic needs. And from that orphans and vulnerable children cash transfer, we have seen other programs growing, disability grants coming in, older persons grants coming in, and we see financing of cash grants moving from about zero at that point, but right now in Kenya, the government itself finances over 95% of social assistance programs. So we are seeing a lot of political will and governments getting involved and planning for these programs. We see South Africa having the best experience in terms of the benefit amount, because in South Africa, those who receive cash grants, they receive a cash grant of almost $100. And in other African countries, it can even be $10 or $20 or $30 or $50. So we see in terms of the benefit amount, South Africa emerges as one of the countries that has a good example, but again, their situations are different. You have a lot of people living in the urban centers. In other countries, you have many people living in the rural setup. So all these benefit amounts are affected by all this, whether it's purely rural, it's highly rural, or it's urban. Because in the rural setup, families are able to produce their own food. When we come to social security, we see that even ILO itself has acknowledged that the African continent has the lowest coverage globally. We see that social security coverage is below 20%, with majority of these countries falling between 10 and 13, only of informal employment workers. And other countries, we see like Zambia and Ghana, were having only about 5%. Therefore, in terms of social security, we see that many countries are struggling to cover informal sector workers, who are many, they contribute to 80 or 83% of the formal of workers are in the informal sector, and they are not covered by any form of social security. So we need to find programs that are supporting schemes that address the informal sector, because that is the large sector that has been left without any form of social protection. When we come also to before I go to health insurance, we look at Mauritius as one of the best examples in terms of having social security schemes that cover the informal sector. We have most of, over 50% of their population is covered. So that emerges as a good practice, which other African countries can follow. And we even see, even during COVID-19, with the rise in unemployment, Mauritius developed some programs to cushion those who are who are getting into unemployment. You go and register at the Labor Ministry, and then immediately people were able to receive some cash grants, those who are falling out, from the unemployment, which has been a bit of a challenge for other countries. And the first speech said, we have a very high unemployment rate in Africa. Therefore, we need to find how do we support the young people who are not employed, who are not in any form of employment. When I come to health insurance also remains very low in our countries. Coverage is very low. Again, most people are covered under the health insurance scheme, which is also targets formal employment. We find many people, the 80% that I'm talking about in the informal sector, having to do outpatient services. They have to buy health services literally on a cash basis, and we have over 45% of even health expenditure in many African countries is out of pocket in terms of health. So that means it's a huge burden for informal workers to become sick. They don't have protection against risks in terms of health, and this calls for how do we support African governments to come up with health insurance schemes that are supporting the informal sector. We have community-based financing. We see a few communities coming together to develop some health schemes, but I think the government needs to take on the good practice that is coming from the communities and scale it up so that we can have the informal sector covered. Finally, our call for this Africa week is the need to extend social protection to informal workers who form a majority of the working population in Africa. We cannot talk about decent work when a substantial group of workers remain vulnerable to risks and shocks. We also need to strengthen the existing social security schemes in order to promote efficiency. And finally, is the issue of social assistance grants, which also need to be strengthened, to be sustainable, to be predictable, because we find they have been established, but in many countries they are not predictable. And we find that still in many countries they are heavily financed by donors. So the EU partnership that we are looking at is a partnership that pushes our governments to to put social assistance in law so that it is financed from the exchequer to a great extent, so that it doesn't depend on donor funding. So sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there. We need to see this sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen, for your intervention and for giving this sort of expose of the various experiences from Kenya to South Africa to Mauritius and elsewhere on the continent, and sort of for bringing the focus also to the informal sector and its massive importance in relation to guaranteeing universal access to social protection, also in line with ILO recommendation 204 from 2015 in this regard, and the collective efforts need to be made to meet the ambitions of the SDGs here. Thank you very much. Let me now finally give the floor to Mr. Carlos Sorinho, member of the European Parliament from Partido Socialista in Portugal. Carlos is the co-chair of the delegation of the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly, and together with colleagues from the Parliament in March this year made a plea to the European Union to assist the ACP countries, and particularly those most impacted and those whose populations are the most vulnerable and whose economies and health systems are the most fragile, in a call for solidarity. Carlos will tell us more about how the European Parliament is supporting or could support the promotion of social protection for all through a stronger EU-Africa partnership. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for good morning, all, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you the vision of the Parliament, the vision of the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly, but also the vision of Socialist MEP and someone with a progressive perspective in these issues. The Sustainable Development Goals are clear in their ambitions to achieve a better world for all, and in particular, in paragraph 8, they advocate sustained promotion, including and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So you are discussing the height issue today. As political representatives of civil society or civil society activists, as progressives and Democrats, it's our obligation to strive for these goals globally, and in particular in the relationship between Africa and Europe. In times of pandemic, of new crises in the air, not only economic but also social crisis, the issue of promoting decent work and social protection for all must be more than ever at the heart of the European, African, and global political agenda. Decent work for all is a battle to be won not only in Africa, but also in Europe. In the partnership between equals that you are currently designing in the European Union Africa strategy, the point 3 of the communication of the European Commission initiative clearly points to the importance of a partnership for sustainable growth and jobs. And we all know social protection is virtually non-existent in sub-Saharan Africa. Employment is extremely precarious, with around 80% of the working population working in subsistence farming or informal economy. Our colleagues talk about that in his communications. it is in the region of the world, in this region of the world, that we find the lowest rate of schooling of a population that is mostly young and where child labor is a hard reality. In this context, we need to be conscious that the European Union has over the years been working on a strategy to improve working conditions for the Europeans, but also encouraging our bilateral and multilateral partners to adopt minimum standards of protection for life at work. You can say that the Commission 2006 communication, Decent Work for All, is the basis of all this reflection. And on this line, in 2007, in the framework of negotiations for a joint Africa-Europe strategy, a consensus emerged that social protection was not only a right, but also an indispensable instrument in supporting progress towards achieving inclusive growth and the sustainable development goals. So now in 2020, we need to follow in this line. And in the new European Union Africa strategy, in this title 3, Partners for Sustainable Growth and Jobs, speaks of economic opportunities and decent job creation in Africa and in the European Union that could be sustainably enhanced through joint action on 4 priority fronts. First, boosting trade and sustainable investments in Africa. Second, improving the investment climate and business environment. Third, increasing access to quality education, skills, research, innovation, health and social rights. And fourth, advancing regional and continental economic integration. So you have the goals, you have the way, and the How Initiative Development Committee report on the European Union Africa Strategy, Development Committee in the European Parliament, on which I am the shadow rapporteur from the S&D group, will soon be adopted by the European Parliament, which will further reinforce and elaborate on the above mentioned points. So the communication of the Commission, the own initiative report in the Development Committee, all is working together to develop and put really in the field these priorities. Concerning now more specifically the work of the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly, for which I am, as you tell, the co-chair, through its Committee on Social Affairs and the Environment, the Assembly is committed to the promotion of social protection and decent job creation, and the most recent example being the draft report on reducing the number of unemployed youth in ACP and EU countries. This report will be presented and voted very soon. Employment opportunities were also the topic of youth conference within the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly plenary, both in Benin and in Rwanda, and the conclusions inevitably led in both cases to the implement need to create easily accessible microcredit schemes and technical guidance and counseling, not only for youth, but for all the active population, as an excellent booster not only of development, but also of gender empowerment. As you can see, the European Union, the European Parliament, the S&D Group, and specifically the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly are strongly committed in the topic under discussion here today. The pandemic made an integrated response even more urgent. A draft report about the consequences of COVID-19 in ACP and EU countries, prepared by the 3 specialized committees of the GPA, will also be put to vote at the end of October in the committees and at the beginning of December this year in the online plenary that will occur in Samoa, but online. This report that includes 51 concrete policy recommendations. It's, in my opinion, and I invite you to read it, a useful roadmap for the EU-Africa multilateral partnership between equals, and reveals the importance of strengthening the GPA ACP European Union in the post-Cotonou Agreement as an institutional instrument of broad commitment and involvement in the transformation process. In conclusion, I would like to summarize the points that I consider crucial in addressing this issue in our Europe-Africa relations. First, the multilateral dimension of the partnership European Union-Africa as a reference for a new cycle of sustainable and humanistic globalization. The multilateral dimension is a very important issue, and we need to use this partnership as an example that multilateralism follows important and possible. A multilateral partnership must be a partnership of equals and to pursue common goals. We must work together to improve working conditions and protection for African and European citizens. These objectives complement each other. They are not mutually excluded, as many argue. And finally, it's essential to pay attention to basic needs, but also seed responses that take into account the new challenge of energy and digital transition and economic, social, and environmental sustainability. This is the most consistent way to fix people in Africa with living conditions, strengthening civil society, participation, the fight for human rights, and support for democratic institutions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your intervention and also for highlighting the progressive responsibility in relation to these very issues that we're talking about today, and the importance of the European progressive force, but also an African progressive force in joining hands in this project to realize these goals. And I think you also alerted this, and previous speakers have done as well, that this will not come about without any kind of fight. We are to be able to establish this. We will have to challenge a lot of power dynamics in Europe as well as outside of Europe, and as such, we will need to join hands to be able to make good on our promises. We are just a little bit behind schedule, but we will now open the floor for a Q&A session, and it will go like this. We've received some questions from in our social media platforms, and you will excuse me, I will look down on my phone to read two of those questions, and I will leave the floor. I will indicate a starting person of the panel to reply to this, and then we will after that anyone else are welcome to take the floor, but you will have to try to make it very short and condense your answers. The first one then goes: how will the EU promote the sustainability of social protection in Africa? Sustainability is the issue here, so the region will not depend in the future from external funds. And so that is the most, we've been talking a little bit about it. What are the most sort of key elements here to be able to achieve sustainability in this regard? And the second question comes from, goes like this: the IMF is already going back to austerity, or seems to go back to talking about austerity, with a significant number of their emergency financing packages promoting fiscal consolidation in the recovery phase. This would undermine advancements and achievements of economic and social rights, including social protection for all. What are your thoughts, and how should this be met? Let's start with Evelyn, and then perhaps move on to Carlos, with Evelyn having the main responsibility for an answer to the IMF issue, and Carlos for the sustainability issue of social protection schemes in Africa, followed by our two other panelists, as you see fit, any of the two questions. So Helen, then Carlos. I'll invite Christina, and then I would give, Evelyn, and then Carlos. I would invite Christina, and then give the final word to Helen in this Q&A. So Evelyn, please, on the IMF issue, what are your thoughts?
I'm very happy that someone mentioned the IMF issue, because there is a serious problem in terms of global coherence within the major international institutions. And we know that we have an SDG goal of extending social protection. We know that we have international labor standards, and yet we have the IMF indeed telling countries that they need to cut benefit levels, cut coverage of certain benefits like pensions, as conditions within their lending programs. And we also have, by the way, the World Bank as well, who's coming out with very contradictory policy advice, both at the international level and at the country level as well. If you've seen the white paper from the World Bank on social protection last year, it's also extremely contradictory towards the objective of extended protections, because it's very focused on means-tested social assistance for the so-called poorest and most vulnerable, and while suggesting to cut back on contributory schemes, cut back on employers' contributions to social protection, and also calling for labor market flexibilization, cutbacks or abolition of minimum wages, and regressive forms of taxation. So this is something that we are very concerned about, addressing very much within our dialogue with the international financial institutions. There are meetings going on this month with the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, in which we attend. We also have a delegation of trade unions that goes to Washington once a year to speak with the leaders of these institutions. We had pushed the IMF for a long time to reconsider their approach to social spending, and we joined with a coalition of different civil society organizations, including the FES, in the Global Coalition on Social Protection Floors, where we wrote a letter to Christine Lagarde 3 years ago, highlighting the inconsistencies in IMF policy. And from there, the IMF actually, they started this. They did some internal strategizing. They had a long consultation with civil society organizations. And then in 2019, they came out with their so-called strategic framework on social spending, which is supposed to redirect country-level advice that the IMF gives within their country programs to have a greater focus on the social impacts of their lending policies. And to have a greater focus on the so-called poorest and most vulnerable. And while we acknowledge that this is a positive step, what we need to first of all see how this actually pans out, because it might just be rhetoric. We haven't actually seen this and done an evaluation on how country level advice has really changed since they've come out with this new framework. But also we need to be very vigilant about the fact that they don't only promote safety nets while cutting back to more comprehensive types of social security. So I don't have an answer for you, but I can say that this is something that's really on our agenda and something that we continue to push for, and where we really need alliances.
Thank you. And I think it also points to what I was speaking to before in terms of how this translates into political struggle as well, to really make the table turns to our favor in terms of progressive policies in this regard. Thank you, Evelyn. Carlos, in terms of sustainability and sustainable financing, how should we go about in the EU-Africa relationships to foster and make sure that this is happening? What are your thoughts?
Thank you very much for the question. It's perhaps a 7 billion euros question. This is the money we have in next period to put that in work. But I think that we need a systemic approach. It's not possible to achieve sustainable social schemes of support and financing if we have not able to create sustainable societies. And for that, we need to work in a systemic way. We need to find people, organizations that in different countries in Africa and in Europe are at the base of this development tissue, and we need to commit and to empower these structures. And when we put in work the financing schemes and also the concretization processes, we need to involve more and more enterprises, more and more regions, more and more people, and also we need to be able to communicate what we are doing in the base, also to the base of the society. But because my experience as a co-president of the GPA, I understand that the elite, some elite in Africa, a little more deep elite in Europe are very aware about the importance of this process. The people that receive the support, okay, they feel the support, but there are a lack of communication between the civil society to understand what you are doing, what is important, why they will need to be involved, why they will be committed. And the sustainability is not a question of law, it's a question of a process and network.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And Christina, you can choose, but I would, if I can choose, I would love to hear how the ILO engages with the IMF and the World Bank on these issues that we're talking with Evelyn about. So if I can influence you in any way, that would be my proposal.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I'm trying to actually address both questions at once, because I think they're very closely related. We're talking on the one hand on sustainability, but on the other hand also the questions about the IMF policies and the international financial institutions in general. And I think maybe I think what is very important, and I think Carlos has really laid that out very importantly, is really to have a systemic response that is not looking at these very small parts and small elements of the social protection system, especially, and I think Evelyn has mentioned that also, in terms of these the programs, the narrowly targeted programs, looking at these short-term safety nets, but it's really to find a more systemic approach that focuses on building the social protection systems, and also have the linkages to the other policies, which are important. And we've heard today about the trade policies, about the macroeconomic policies, about the employment and labor market policies. And I think looking at that in an integrated way is a really important part of the response. And actually, Evelyn has already talked about the concerns. And I think for the ILO, many of those concerns are shared, and we have made that also clear. And we are also, we have very talking with our colleagues at the World Bank and engaging in dialogue with the IMF. This is really something that the ILO does in a very active way. Because we know that there is a need for greater policy coherence. And we see for the ILO, the ILO is a tripartite organization where we have governments and workers and employers around the table. We're very happy that there is actually a very strong consensus and a very strong vision for building social protection systems, for building also having very solid social protection floors as a very key element of these social protection systems. But we also see that this is not necessarily the same vision as the ministries of finance have. And especially also those representatives which influence the decisions at the IMF and at the World Bank. So I think there is really a need also for greater policy coherence in that respect. And we really see that the European Union as a whole, the member states and the European institutions are really trying to also promote this policy coherence more widely. And I think this is a very important element of that response, so that we can really get to better policy responses in the longer run. And I think these efforts of really promoting that kind of policy coherence, I think these really need to be continued in a very strong way, and they need to be intensified, because I don't think we're at a place where we want to be in that respect. And so I would hope that now with the ongoing meetings, the annual meetings now going on in Washington, or rather virtually around the world, we would hope that there is actually a very strong message that that really takes these kind of policy responses more and more broadly, and really help to avoid that we see this kind of very very adverse and dangerous fiscal consolidation policies undermining actually the policy response and the policy recovery that we seem to see, because I think we are not yet out of the woods. And we need really to have to build, the stronger social protection systems. We need to have much more efforts in securing decent work for everyone. And I think there's was also something that Helen was talking about in a very illustrative way for Africa. I think there's so much to be done, and we need to have that policy coherence really to do that jointly. So just to add.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Then, Helen, you can choose freely among the two topics.
Okay, thank you. I want to acknowledge the support that we see in terms of strengthening social protection systems in Africa. I think there is a lot of support from the EU, the World Bank, UNICEF, and other key players in the social protection sector around the world. So we are seeing our systems improving, information systems, how benefits are provided. We are seeing a lot of support with that. So I hope that will make social protection more sustainable in Africa. We need to have an advocacy strategy that promotes a certain percentage of the GDP to move to social protection. In the health sector, there's always a push for African governments to spend 15% of the GDP on the health sector, but we haven't attained 15%. But that forms a basis for civil society organizations to push for the exchequer to move towards a certain percentage. So that hasn't been done in terms of social protection. Let me talk on the issue of corruption in Africa, because I know we haven't mentioned about it even in this forum. There is a lot of money that is going into corruption, and there's a lot of wastage in corruption. But I think a lot of the international players are very silent about it. And the more we keep quiet, I think the more we are feeding this monster. Even within this pandemic, in many countries, we've seen cases of corruption coming up, but we haven't seen international organizations coming out very strongly to condemn these acts. And so we are feeding the monster by keeping quiet. So I think there's need to come out and talk about it and even have consequences around it. I think when we don't have consequences, then we see them coming up over and over. Then I think, Christina mentioned, the need to define social protection flows at national level. National governments coming together and defining what does social protection flows look like for our country, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. Every country should establish its own parameters. And then finally, the issue of civil society engagement. I think we've seen a drop in financing for civil society organizations to engage, especially in social protection. I think I haven't seen a call from the EU in the many years, in the last few years, that focuses specifically on civil society. We are seeing a lot of funding going directly into governments and not civil society. So the demand, the accountability for social protection programs has reduced because civil society engagement has also reduced. So I think there's need to strengthen how civil society organizations engage. If you look at HIV, AIDS, other pandemics that have happened before, and other processes like children, women, there's funding that comes directly only for civil society to engage with those processes. And we have seen better outcomes than what we are seeing now in social protection, because the players are mainly many organizations are preferring to work directly with governments, and therefore the role of civil society has been minimized. And now there are a lot of gaps that may emerge, which civil society could help to address. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you for raising the importance of involving civil society. And it actually forms a very nice bridge to a discussant. And I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Trenton Elsley, Director of the Labour Research Services, a trade union support organization based in South Africa, to engage with the panel. Trenton, the floor is yours.
Viva Solidar, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. So very quickly then, I will talk in and around the inputs from the presenters and say that I think social protection at its heart is not something else. Social protection is not another set of policies. And I think when thinking about social protection as central, I want to point to two things. One is that I believe that social protection has to have what I would call social resonance. It needs to exist in the vocabulary of governance and the governance. And I think at its heart, social protection is about security, a fundamental human need. It's not fancy. It's about security. And this is a fundamental need. And it needs to resonate in some way with a culture of government and a culture of those governed. And it needs to be ideally a central aim of government. And I think perhaps one way of saying it is it's the difference between finding fiscal space for social protection, which doesn't really situate social protection centrally, and the different approach might be socializing the fiscus as a more central approach. Easier said than done, of course. A second element I would like to raise is that social protection, as I'm sure many of the presenters would agree, needs to have broad and varied expression in a range of policy and legislation. So what I'm suggesting is that we cannot sacrifice security in this set of policies and try and promote policy in another set. It needs to find broad expression across the suite of policy and legislation in a national setting, for instance. I think social protection only makes sense if it is anchored in the state. I think civil society can complement and play a very important role, don't get me wrong, but I think social protection only really makes sense if it's anchored in the state. And so whether we're considering education, health, industrial policy, and the one I would like to focus on very quickly, for instance, labor market policy and the centrality of the world of work in particular, they must all echo social protection. And so very quickly, the centrality of the world of work and decent work. Quick note on COVID-19. I don't know if it's controversial to say it, but I think that there's more that is old about COVID-19 than there is new. I feel like I see COVID-19 more as a stimulant to established trends rather than something brand new. So the world of work, I think if employment is central to the world of work in all its different forms. If employment itself undermines social protection, then I think we have an impossible contradiction to deal with. And I think many of the newer employment relations, what you might call newer, they're starting to look like the vocabulary of insecurity. 0-hour contracts, dependent contractors, permanent part-timers. Reminds me of Fresh Frozen, doesn't it? The gig economy, which in many respects, in a sense, is a formalized race to the bottom. And so there's a sense that security is being sacrificed on the altar of flexibility, and we are effectively socializing the cost of security and, of course, privatizing the profit. So the question that concerns me, and which I suppose in a broad way I'm putting to the presenters, is how to confront something like the flexibility of labor, how to confront something as irresistible as the gig economy, because you do feel like it is quite irresistible. I would throw out a few ideas. I think a broader idea is norms for decent work, norms for decent pay, and even more broadly, norms of a decent life. I find, well, in my own country, South Africa, but in the many other African countries, there is no clear vision, no sort of empirically grounded vision of what a decent life looks like. And I think it's very difficult if we don't know what the vision is to which we want to move, then a road is a very difficult thing to map. I see that as really important. I see no way around regulation, establishing minimum standards to confront, for instance, the legal fiction that, for instance, an Uber driver is an independent contractor. I think to anyone paying attention, it's nonsense. Simply put, I think we have to make flexibility expensive. There has to be a premium on flexibility. Fourthly, I think we need, as always, we need to build civil society, the machines of democracy, if you will, which plays a really important role in the promotion of the decent work and a decent life. And finally, the importance, I think, of role modeling from the North, especially through global value chains, a very important linkage. And on that note, I will end and point out that my next engagement right after this is a launch of a program of work with the ITC Africa on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which in itself presents an interesting prospect on the continent. Thanks so much for the time, Mika.
Thank you very much, Trenton, for the number of very interesting issues raised. I will give the floor to each presenter for a very brief sort of reflection on Trenton's comments, and you can cherry pick as you will. For this time, I'll give you 1 minute each, and I will start this time with Helen. Free to pick up any point.
Well, I think I should say that, like he said, I'll just focus on the issue of civil society because that's where I come from. It's true. It's important that the government, because the government is the duty bearer. So if governments are able to finance social protection from their own systems, the better. He's also talked about the gig economy, and definitely these are the emerging things that social protection needs to be aware of because it's not static. It needs to be dynamic to address the needs of groups that are coming up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Carlos.
Okay, I will use my minute to talk about the conditionality because when I trip through Africa in my institutional job, a lot of times the question people ask me why European Union put so many conditionalities. Chinese, Russians, or Americans have any conditionality. It's not true. Our conditionality is a positive conditionality. It's a conditionality to fight for climate change, to fight for human rights, for transparency, for decent work. It's a common challenge for Africa and for Europe. This kind of conditionality is better than the conditionality to sell weapons, to control financial systems, or to control infrastructures. So let's head with this partnership between European Union and Africa in a progressive way.
Thank you, Carlos, for this. And then Christina.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. And I really immensely enjoyed Trenton's comments. I think maybe just to pick out one element, and this was the point about the kind of the emerging kind of work and employment relationships, the whole point about the future of work. where we see many of the old forms in a way of dependency, of precariousness, of insecurity, reappearing in a kind of new and sometimes very kind of fancy looking way. And sometimes there is a tendency in discussing these to say, well, I mean, actually, for social protection, I mean, let's forget about what we have established in the past. This will not be really kind of appropriate for these new employment relationships, and we think we should kind of just kind of start from a blank slate and really start anew. And I think nothing could be kind of more wrong than that. Because I think, I mean, social protection systems, I mean, in the whole history of social protection systems, they've always been adapted, and they were constantly adapting to new challenges. And I think this is really a challenge that we need to take on in a very positive and constructive way, and really think about how we can improve, how we can reinforce, how we can reinvigorate social protection systems, that they actually can respond to these challenges, but also to other challenges that will emerge when we think about climate change, when we think about just transitions, when we think about global supply chains. So it's really trying to think about how to really adapt these social protection systems in a way that they can really better respond to it. Especially with supporting people to really face the important transitions that they are facing during their lives, and be able to really support them in engaging in work, and not only paid work, but also the unpaid work that we need to talk about. And really take that in a very positive way, embracing, but making sure that the principles that are so important for us, the principle of solidarity, the principle of making sure that there's gender equality, etc., are really the principles that we can support. And so it's really about strengthening and reinvigorating those social protection systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And Evelyn, finally, and I'll ask you to be brief again.
Yes, I'm conscious of the time constraints. So I think going on the topic of future of work and the increasing precarization of the labor market, I just want to say that we should not treat these trends as inevitable, and that this is not a phenomenon that has come out of nowhere. These new forms of work have proliferated within a policy context, in the absence of regulation, or in some cases explicit deregulation for governments to make it easier for employers and even financially advantageous to use short-term contracts, dependent self-employed relationships, and other types of precarious contracts. So I think first and foremost, we need to have regulations in place to require employers to take responsibility for their workers. And there are a lot of other things that need to be done, but we don't have time to discuss them now.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming back to the importance of political choices in this regard, in terms of how we regulate or deregulate markets. And thank you, Trenton, for this. I will now give the floor to, if I may, I want to also mention in this context that right now, 12 o'clock, starts an interview, a very interesting interview with the Nobel Prize laureate Dr. Denis Mukwege, in another channel. So for those of you who want to join that conversation, now is the time. For my fellow panelists, if I would kindly ask you for some 5 to 10 minutes more of your time, if that's okay with you. We could go on with one more intervention. It's been experiencing some technical hiccups. I see a few nodding heads, so I take that as a general yes then. And I will give the floor to my friend and colleague from Solidarité Laïque, Africa de l'Ouest, Director Mr. Nwaga Pierre Sawadogo, representing a network of civil society organizations promoting social work, the right to education, and fight for equality in France and across the world. Pierre, the floor is yours. He will speak French, and I myself is not an expert in French, I'm afraid, but I will have some assistance to sum up the question in English. Pierre, bienvenue.
Allô? Allô?
Allô, hein? Salut, Pierre. Mon petit difficile. Seems that the difficulties remain, I'm afraid.
Allô? Allô? Vous m'entendez?
Yes. Allô, Pierre.
Oui, désolé, j'ai compris que...
Well, I thought I could speak now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Well, in the English booth, we can, sir.
All right. I'm sorry, my friend. We will have to come back to our conversation later on this very important topic. As many of you have said, this is a process that will be ongoing for a long time. So we will have several occasions to come back to how to best mobilize and work together for this issue. I will then, without any further ado, give the floor to my colleague and co-organizer, Mr. Daniela Ihler, Policy Officer with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's EU office, for some final words. Daniela, the floor is yours. We end in a strike of bad luck.
Yeah, no.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, there I am. Typical fault. I forgot my microphone. Okay, then. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, to all our panelists for this, I think, very inspiring discussion. It was very interesting, and I think it was also, well, at least in my view, let's say, a big plea that we need to further strengthen social security schemes and decent work, and also to accelerate our measures to achieve these SDG goals. However, well, clock is ticking, I would say. It's called the Agenda 2030. So there are only, let's say, 10 years left. And as you all know, setting up security systems, social security schemes, this is something which takes time. It needs, what was also mentioned here in the discussion, funding, national laws, but first and foremost also political will. And in the end, these schemes should not only cover formal workers, this was mentioned by Helen, but also cover informal workforce. I think our panelists have provided us here with some interesting ideas and also avenues. And they also rightly highlighted, that it's not only social policy, but it needs to go beyond. Trade policy was mentioned, taxation was mentioned, budget policy was mentioned. So in the end, this is also a question, I think Christina mentioned it, of policy, of policy coherence. And today's discussions, I think, also underline so that the task in general is huge, it's challenging, and in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, also even more urgent. And it requires actions of various stakeholders, the EU, governments in Africa, regional, international organizations. So kind of, let's say, joint commitment, or to quote you, Michael, I liked it very much, a kind of new social contract. And we as FVS, I think we are ready to support these stakeholders, be it at
local level, for example, in Kenya, where we also have working groups with trade unions and also civil society groups to discuss social policies, be it at regional level, where we cooperate as FES with the ILO Africa, also in the area of social justice, workers' rights, or at global level, where together with the Global Coalition for Social Protection Force, we developed, I think 5 years ago, a social protection index. Well, we're here in Brussels. Let's say in a nutshell, I think we as FES, and I hope I also speak also on behalf of all my colleagues, be it in Berlin or worldwide, we also are committed to this agenda to promote decent work and social protection. Just to conclude, I think because we are in Brussels here, not you, Michael, but FES and the colleagues of Solidar, I think we have a particular commitment to hold the EU accountable and to make sure that the Agenda 2030 keeps a central place in EU development policies, and in particular also that social policies are promoted much more in the future. And I stop here. And thank you very much again to all our panelists.
Thank you, Daniela. And thanks. Let me also then thank you, our distinguished panelists, the participants, everyone viewing today and today's discussions. I think the ongoing MFF negotiations, the current programming process defining EU development cooperation, and the forthcoming EU-Africa summit are only a few of the occasions that we are able to join hands and push for decent work and social protection for all, including equal access to public services in EU-Africa relations, more broadly in EU development cooperation, as well as the policies for Europe and here at home. I won't say much more. I hope to see you all soon again. We have a shared job to do. That is for sure. I think in order to win the systemic approach, in order to change the structures of government and economy, there is no real or easy way forward apart from joining hands and working together as progressive alliance. And form those alliances and push for those policy reforms in the most comprehensive way possible. So I hope to see you all again in these settings, or rather in person, when that's possible again. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Christina, Carlos, Helen, for your interventions. I wish you some really interesting continued days in of the SND EU Africa week. Take care. See you all soon. Bye-bye.